Do you remember the sound before you even saw the station? That double ding? Two quick electronic chimes triggered by a black rubber hose stretched across the concrete apron, announcing your arrival to someone before you'd even come to a full stop? You remember the way the attendant appeared almost instantly, wiping his hands on a rag that never seemed to get any cleaner, wearing a collared shirt with an oval patch stitched over the pocket with his first name on it, walking toward your window before you'd even rolled it down. If that sound just surfaced in your memory for the first time in decades, welcome. This channel exists for exactly that jolt. We're not chasing the big anniversaries or the famous headlines here. We're after the ordinary textures of American life that quietly disappeared, the small daily rituals nobody thought to write down because everybody assumed they'd always be there. If that's the kind of remembering you're here for, stick around, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. Today, we're going back to the full-service gas station of the 1960s. The story of full service doesn't start with a marketing decision. It starts with a business model that made mechanical and economic sense in a way that's easy to forget now. Gas stations, as we'd recognize them, began taking shape in the 1910s and 1920s. But it was the post-war boom, the interstate highway system authorized under Eisenhower in 1956, the explosion of car ownership, and the suburban migration that turned the gas station into something closer to a small-town institution. Companies like Standard Oil, Texaco, Shell, and Phillips 66 built out sprawling networks of branded stations. And they didn't just want you to buy gasoline. They wanted your loyalty, your recurring business, your trust in a brand you'd choose over the competitor 3 blocks down, who was selling the exact same product for the exact same price. Gasoline in that era was remarkably undifferentiated. You couldn't taste it, couldn't see it, couldn't tell one company's product from another once it was in your tank. So the oil companies competed on something else entirely: service. Full service wasn't an act of generosity. It was the only lever available to win your business in a commodity market, and that single economic fact shaped almost everything about how these stations looked, sounded, and operated. The station itself was not an afterthought bolted onto a fuel pump. Many of the era's stations were designed by actual architects working for the oil companies, and the results carried real intention. Texaco commissioned Walter Darwin Teague, one of the most influential industrial designers in America, to create a standardized station look in the 1930s that carried forward for decades: porcelain enamel panels in white and green, a streamlined canopy, clean geometric lines, meant to look modern and trustworthy from a moving car. You'd pull in under that canopy, and the first thing you'd register, before any human interaction at all, was the architecture doing its job. A building that looked clean, orderly, almost medical in its whiteness, designed specifically to counter the grimy, disreputable reputation gas stations had earned in their earliest decades. You pulled up to the pumps, and the pumps themselves were mechanical sculptures in their own right. Tall, rounded top units with a clock-face dial on the front, the numbers clicking over with an audible mechanical stutter as the gallons ticked upward. No digital readout, just gears, and a spinning dial you could watch spin. The price per gallon, in 1965, averaged around 31 cents. And you'd watch that dollar total climb in a way that felt strangely satisfying, almost tactile, compared to the silent, blinking numerals of today. The attendant reached your window and asked what you wanted. "Fill it up," was the phrase, spoken so often it became a kind of American idiom. And then, he was in motion. He unscrewed your gas cap, inserted the nozzle, set the automatic shut-off lever, and while the tank filled, he was already moving to your windshield with a squeegee and a bucket of blue-tinted washer fluid, working the glass in long, even strokes, getting the corners. The wipers lifted and set back down with a practiced snap. Then the hood popped, and he was checking your oil, pulling the dipstick, wiping it on the rag, reinserting it, reading the level against the etched markings, checking your radiator coolant, glancing at your tire pressure, sometimes topping off air right there at the pump if a gauge told him it was low. This was not a special add-on service you paid extra for. This was what full service meant, bundled into the price of gasoline itself, performed in the same 8 or 10 minutes it took to fill an 18-gallon tank. Inside, if you went in to pay or use the restroom, the smell hit you immediately, a specific blend of rubber from stacked tires. The mineral tang of motor oil, the sharper chemical bite of solvent used to clean tools, all of it laid over a faint gasoline undertone that never fully left the air, no matter how far back from the pumps you walked. The service bay, often visible right through the office, had a hydraulic lift with a car raised overhead, a mechanic underneath in coveralls, a pegboard wall hung with wrenches organized by size, and a red metal Coca-Cola cooler humming in the corner. Stocked with glass bottles, you'd pop the cap off using an opener bolted to the machine itself. Many stations sold more than fuel, tires, batteries, small appliances, road maps handed out free at the counter, printed by the oil companies themselves as a service to encourage road trips. That would, naturally, require more of their gasoline. The restrooms, often criticized even at the time for inconsistent cleanliness, were nonetheless treated as a genuine amenity, a public restroom you could count on finding at nearly any intersection in America, key usually chained to a piece of wood or a hubcap so nobody would accidentally pocket it. And the whole operation ran on relationships. You likely had a station you went back to, an attendant who knew your car, maybe knew your name, who'd mentioned that your fan belt was starting to fray before you'd noticed anything wrong yourself. But here's the thing people rarely talk about when they get nostalgic for this era. Full service wasn't primarily an act of hospitality. It was skilled, physically demanding labor performed largely by young men and teenagers, for wages that, by most historical estimates, hovered not far above the era's minimum wage, which sat at $1.25 an hour through much of the mid-1960s. These were entry-level jobs, often a teenager's first job. Standing outside in July heat and January cold, inhaling exhaust fumes and gasoline vapor for a full shift, performing repetitive physical tasks dozens of times a day. The warmth you remember, the attention, the checking under the hood, the friendly banter, was real, but it existed inside a labor structure that asked a lot of the people providing it for pay that reflected the era's low floor for unskilled and semi-skilled work. Understanding that doesn't cancel out the nostalgia. It deepens it because it means the pleasant experience you remember was built on somebody else's effort, not on some naturally friendlier culture that simply vanished on its own. And it also reveals something about the built environment of that era worth sitting with. The gas station was a forced site of human contact. You could not fill your own tank. The mechanical shutoff nozzle existed, but the norms and, in some states, actual laws required an attendant to operate it. That constraint, pure friction, pure inconvenience by modern standards, is precisely what generated the interaction, the recognition, the small-town texture people remember so fondly. Convenience and connection were, in this specific physical arrangement, direct trade-offs against one another, and it's worth being honest that we generally chose convenience once we had the option. The decline of full service didn't happen because people stopped valuing it. It happened because of a specific, traceable sequence of economic shocks and regulatory shifts. The 1973 oil embargo, triggered by OPEC in response to American support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, sent gasoline prices spiking and created the infamous lines at pumps across the country, sometimes wrapping around city blocks, rationed by license plate number on odd and even days. That crisis fundamentally changed how Americans related to gasoline, no longer an abundant, cheap commodity you could afford to buy with a smile and a full-service ritual attached, but suddenly a scarce, anxiety-inducing resource you wanted to get as fast as possible. Self-service stations, which had existed in a handful of states since the 1940s, but were restricted or banned outright in many others, spread rapidly through the 1970s as states repealed those laws under economic pressure, since self-service stations could charge less per gallon precisely because they didn't carry attendant labor costs. New Jersey and Oregon remain the two holdouts today, still legally requiring attendant-pumped gas, a fact that surprises younger drivers who assume self-service has always been universal. But everywhere else, the math simply won. A self-service station needed a fraction of the staff. Convenience store chains began attaching themselves to gas stations in the late 1970s and, through the 1980s, 7-Eleven, Circle K, shifting the profit model entirely away from service and toward retail markup on snacks, cigarettes, and soda, sold through a register instead of earned through skilled labor at the pump. The 1979 energy crisis, following the Iranian Revolution, delivered a second gut punch to the old model, reinforcing that speed and price, not ceremony, were what drivers now prioritized. By the early 1980s, full-service islands were shrinking to a single lane at most stations, offered at a premium price for the dwindling number of customers willing to pay for it, and by the 1990s, for most of the country, that lane was simply gone. So where does that leave the honest comparison, looking at it now with some distance? Modern gas stations are safer in real, measurable ways. Automatic shut-off technology is more reliable. Environmental regulations from the EPA, starting in the 1980s and 1990s, addressed the underground storage tank leaks that had quietly contaminated groundwater at old stations for decades. And vapor recovery systems now capture fumes that attendants and customers use to breathe in directly. You're not standing in a cloud of unregulated gasoline vapor the way you once were, and that matters, genuinely, even if it's not the part anyone gets nostalgic for. Prices are more transparent, payment is faster, and you have control over exactly how much you spend and how you spend it, rather than trusting a stranger's judgment about how full your tank needs to be. What's gone is harder to quantify but no less real. It's the built-in excuse for human contact. The small mechanical checkup that might have caught a problem before it became a breakdown on the highway. The sense that the person handling your car cared, in some professional if transactional way, about whether it made it safely to its next stop. It's a job that, whatever its low wages, gave a lot of American teenagers their first taste of responsibility and public interaction, a rite of passage that's largely been automated out of existence. We didn't lose full service to some vague cultural decline in friendliness. We lost it to OPEC, to state legislatures repealing attendant laws, to convenience store economics, and to millions of individual drivers, ourselves included, who decided a few cents a gallon and a faster stop mattered more than a squeegee and a friendly face. And it's worth sitting with the fact that we chose this, collectively, one fill-up at a time, even as we mourn it now. So tell me, what was your station? Do you remember the name on the sign? The attendant who knew your car? The specific sound that hose made when you pulled in? Put it in the comments. I want to know exactly where you were.